Hi there, my name is Madeline Kopnick. I am a graduate student at Morningside College and a social studies teacher at Bettendorf High School. Today I'm going to talk to you about critical reading interventions in the secondary social studies classroom and their impact on historical reading and thinking skills. So the problem here that I was trying to address when I was starting out is looking at a lack of literacy skills among today's students. So about 2 out of 3 high school graduates in 2011 actually met the college readiness benchmark in English, and not being able to have these literacy skills can negatively impact students' future college and career readiness in a lot of different ways. There are also some issues with aligning social studies instruction with the Common Core standards, which do require social studies to teach literacy skills. So many teachers are unfamiliar with these new standards and also unfamiliar with how to actually implement literacy skills in the social studies classroom. Some personal reasons I chose this topic. I have seen in my own classroom the struggles that students face with historical thinking and writing skills, and this intervention also fit well with what my department is working on right now to increase reading and writing in the social studies classroom. Some quick background here through the literature review. Some previous critical reading interventions that helped lay the base for my research. Almost all the literature addressed some sort of primary source analysis. So this is an instructional technique used to develop students' historical thinking and writing skills. And document-based questions, or DBQs, are one way of going about this. A DBQ is a strategy to use analysis and interpretation of a variety of documents to answer a central historical question, which is what I will later on have students do in my research. Wanzek et al. From 2015, they developed an intervention called the PACT framework, promoting acceleration of comprehension and content through text. And this includes a combination of reading, writing, and discussion in the classroom. And it's also used to measure reading comprehension and content acquisition. So this will sort of lay the basis for my own research later on. Some impacts of critical reading interventions that I found throughout the literature. There's a positive relationship between the use of primary sources in the social studies classroom and meeting the Common Core state standards. Guided questioning, like what would be present in a DBQ, actually helps students understand topics at a deeper level. And discussion, which also occurs as part of a DBQ. When students participated in discussions, they scored better on measures of historical knowledge. So those are some of the factors there that I ended up including in my research. Some potential problems that came out of the literature review. Many social studies teachers are unfamiliar with different components of the Common Core state standards. Additionally, many social studies teachers who are familiar with the CCSS are not in favor of implementing them in the social studies field. So there's a little bit of pushback there and some issues with implementing these standards. And finally, the majority of secondary high school social studies lessons use one textbook to teach most of the material, which my research is going to challenge that. So really the gap here, there's a lot of research about social studies and reading comprehension, but very few studies have actually looked at improving historical thinking skills and writing skills through the use of these interventions. The purpose of this study is to measure the effect of a critical reading intervention on historical reading and writing abilities. As I just discussed, previous studies have looked at other content areas, specifically foreign language, science, and English, but social studies has not had a lot of attention in the literature thus far. Previous studies have measured reading comprehension and content knowledge exclusively, whereas this research is going to look at writing skills. And eventually this research has the potential to provide specifically social studies classroom teachers with some literacy strategies they can implement to help their students improve their historical thinking and writing skills. All right, so the overarching goals and objectives for this research. I gathered data from quantitative research to determine the impact of the critical reading intervention on historical thinking and writing skills. The tool I focused on was that critical reading intervention, which was based on the PACT framework, as I previously discussed, and we did use a document-based question. The measurement or assessment device was the Regents exam in Global History and Geography, which was developed by the state of New York. And my original hypothesis, the implementation of critical reading interventions will improve student scores on the Regents exam in Global History and Geography. Our two different variables here, the independent variable was whether students received the critical reading intervention, the DBQ, versus whether they just received traditional instruction. And the dependent variable was student scores on that Regents assessment. So I used a non-equivalent control group design because it wasn't possible for me to do an actual true experiment due to the limitations with my classes. But the participants were all 10th grade world history students. We ended up with 20 students in the control group and 23 students in the experimental group. In that control group, 2 students had IEPs and 1 student had a 504 plan. In the experimental group, 1 student had an IEP and 2 students had a 504 plan. Otherwise, the demographics were relatively similar. Some materials that were used in this research project, the textbook World History Patterns of Interaction, published in 2007 by McDougall Little, a Legacy of Rome graphic organizer, PowerPoint presentation created by the teacher, the History Channel documentary The Fall of the Roman Empire, the Roman Contributions DBQ packet. This was only provided to the experimental group. And finally, the assessment, the Regents examination in Global History and Geography. So some other methods. The procedure for both groups was relatively similar. It started with both groups reading a section out of the textbook about Rome's impact on the world. So they read a certain section of the textbook, took some notes on their graphic organizer. We moved on to the PowerPoint where they continued to take notes. They watched the Fall documentary, and then this is where it switches off for the experimental group versus the control group. The experimental group was exposed to the DBQ process. So they read through different sources surrounding this topic. We had some class discussion and they answered some guided questions before we moved on to the assessment, whereas the control group just sort of skipped that DBQ process part. The Regents exam is considered a reliable measure. It has an alpha coefficient of 0.92, and it also is considered valid. It was controlled in numerous ways. Test content and response process are very tightly controlled by the state on a Regents exam. There's field testing of the questions ahead of time, so that sort of speaks to its validity. And then data analysis was performed here. We used 2 independent samples t-tests for both the pre-test and the post-test, and then the mean scores on those 2 examinations were compared. The results, our hypothesis was confirmed. So scores on the Regents exam in Global History and Geography did go up with the inclusion of the critical reading intervention. We did have a statistically significant increase with the t-score of negative 2.41 and a p-value of 0.021. The experimental group scored on average about 5 points higher than the control group, with a mean of 33.91 in the experimental group compared to a mean of 28.65 in the control group. You can see those scores are also shown here, and it's really important to look at this pretest row. You can see the t-score for the pretest showed a t-value of negative 0.048, which shows that there's not a lot of variability in the scores of students on the pretest before they took this. So this tells us that our 2 groups, our 2 experimental and control groups, are performing at relatively a similar rate before we take this, before we introduce the critical reading intervention. On figure 1 here, you can see mean score on the Regents exam. You can see again that the scores did increase for the experimental group as compared to the control group. So some connection to past research and theory based on the results. This really supports the growing practice of using social studies as a vehicle for teaching literacy skills. So this corroborates research by especially Newman, Degner, and Wu from 2015, which suggests that primary sources used in the social studies classroom are a really important way to reach those Common Core state standards. It also suggests that primary source analysis is an effective strategy to improve historical thinking and writing skills. Specifically including that discussion, writing, guided questioning, those things are all important here. So Miller and Toth found that a structured curriculum, like what would be included in the DBQ process, that's necessary for students to understand perspective of a text, message of a text, and all of those things could contribute to increased historical thinking and writing skills. Wissinger and De La Paz from 2017 found students that participate in a verbal discussion with their classmates are able to demonstrate more historical knowledge in their own writing as well. And finally, Zagora from 2011 showed that increasing the quantity of any sort of writing in the classroom in general is going to increase historical thinking and writing skills as well. So the control group did significantly more writing than the experimental group did consistently more writing than the control group did. And then finally, this expands on the work of Wanzek and Vaughn from 2016, and also Wanzek et al. From 2015, measuring reading comprehension and content knowledge. This takes it one step further toward this historical thinking and writing skills as well. To pass theory here, a constructivist learning theory states that knowledge is constructed by students through their active participation, student-centered environments, engaging with multiple perspectives. So in the DBQ process, it requires active participation of students. They are not sitting and getting material. And it also exposes them to different ideas and perspectives through different sources. Multiliteracy theory is a smaller component of constructivist learning theory, and multiliteracy theories focuses on using multiple modes of communication or ways to expose students to material. So this increases the amount of information they're exposed to and also the perspectives that they see. This is especially helpful in the literacy process because students can find specific evidence to support their claims in ways they might not be able to find from a textbook. So some important implications from my research. The DBQ process and critical reading interventions as a whole hold the potential to increase historical skills and knowledge for high school social studies students. Social studies as a discipline can be used to teach literacy skills and will be required to with the Common Core state standards. There is a huge potential here for interdisciplinary literacy instruction. So between English and social studies, science and social studies, any combination of those to help students learn about literacy in different ways. And finally, teachers should incorporate and teach primary source analysis in the social studies classroom. Ideally, that would start at a younger age, in the middle school, junior high age. By the time they get to high school, they're more familiar with it. But really, any students who take a college course in history, they're going to have to interact with these sources and have the literacy skills to do so. All right, so some limitations of this study. Data was only collected from one unit of a year-long class. Effects of students' home life cannot be controlled for, things like completing homework. Some students were enrolled concurrently in English class and others were not, based on our 4x4 block schedule. Small sample size of about 43 10th grade world history students is pretty specific. And then student engagement and reading comprehension were not measured in this study. So some recommendations for future research to help address these issues. You could use the same research project process for more than one unit in a year. You can control for factors such as socioeconomic factors and other classes that the student is currently enrolled in. Look at a larger sample size and then more diverse sample in regards to course, age, and grade levels. So looking at different social studies classes at different grade levels. And there are my references. Thank you so much.